DeWayne Louis Tiny Lund was born on November 14th, 1929 from Harlan, Iowa, United States. Lund started racing at a young age on a motorcycle, then moved on to midget cars and sprint cars. He served in the Korean War in the United States Air Force, and in 1955, he decided to try stock car racing in NASCAR. In his early years, Tiny Lund went south with a 1955 Chevrolet and competed in a Lehigh, Arkansas event with sponsorships from Carl Rupert and his safety belt company. Tiny Lund qualified mid-pack in his debut, but his event ended in an accident on lap number 65. Tiny Lund's car flipped end over end and his safety belt broke. He was bruised and had a broken arm. For the 1956 season, Tiny Lund teamed up with Gus Holzmuller, and their best result was a fourth-place finish in Columbus, South Carolina. Tiny Lund also ran a few events for A.J. Bumgarner. In 1957, Tiny Lund split his time between Bumgarner's Pontiacs and a Petty Enterprises Oldsmobile. With Bumgarner, Lund controlled the majority of the event at the Cleveland County Fairgrounds short dirt track in Shelby, North Carolina. He won the pole position and led 136 of 200 laps, wherein he got his right rear axle gave out with 14 laps to go. Tiny Lund had two other poles on that season. Late in the 1957 season at the North Wilkesboro Speedway, a wheel from Lund's car was thrown into the stands. A spectator was killed. After the season, Tiny Lund left Bumgarner and continued his journeyman driving in 1958, winning the pole position at races in Gastonia and Hillsborough. In 1959, he was the owner of his own self-owned Chevrolet team. Tiny Lund did not have major success with that, and he was rideless by 1963. In 1963, Tiny Lund traveled to Daytona International Speedway. He was looking for a ride for the 500, but the problem was he was broke. He came into Daytona with 17 cents, so that meant he had no money for a ride for the Daytona 500. He needed a miracle. 10 days before the big race, Tiny Lund's friend Marvin Panch, the Wood Brothers Racing team driver and 1961 Daytona 500 champion, was testing a Maserati for the Daytona Continental 3-hour race. Unfortunately for Marvin Panch, his car was going so fast, the car was picked up by the air, it flipped, and landed right side up, and unfortunately the car caught on fire. But for Tiny Lund, he and four other guys managed to run towards the car, help out Marvin Panch. While they were picking up the car, trying to lift it up for Marvin's safety. While they were about to get Marvin out of the blazing car, the fire roared up and the car exploded. Everybody thought Marvin Panch was a goner. But fortunately, Marvin Panch survived. Unfortunately, he could not race in the Daytona 500. But thanks for his heroism, Marvin Panch asked Tiny Lund to take his ride in the Wood Brothers Racing entry for the Daytona 500. On February 24th, 1963, the fourth annual Daytona 500 was finally here. Fireball Roberts started on the pole, and the dual winners were Junior Johnson for the first one and Johnny Rutherford for the second one. Meanwhile, with Tiny Lund, he started 12th for the big race. The 1963 Daytona 500 started out 10 laps under yellow, with laps counted because of rain, and after 10 laps into the big race, the race was finally underway. Throughout the entire race, it's been two cars, two superstars, racing against each other, leading the most laps. It was Fred Lorenzon in number 28 and Ned Jarrett in the number 11. Now all of a sudden, here comes the third driver, the long shot coming into the 500, Tiny Lund, who's replacing Marvin Panch, is racing against the two superstars, the two dominant drivers of Fred Lorenzon and Ned Jarrett. While the battle was still going on, there was question about who will be pitting for the final time in the race. The first victim became Fred Lorenzon, who led 77 laps throughout the race, has pitted for fuel with 7 laps to go. And then there were two, Ned Jarrett in the 11, Tiny Lund in number 21, to see who can stay out the longest. After playing the cat and mouse game, chasing each other for 2 laps, Ned Jarrett became the second victim, part of the battle, to pit for fuel with 5 laps to go. Although Ned Jarrett did not win the Daytona 500, he ended up finishing third after leading 26 laps. And then there's Tiny Lund. He is doing the unthinkable. He was the long shot coming into this race with no ride, 17 cents, helped on Marvin Panch, and it replaced him for the 500. The checker flag is out, and Tiny Lund became the 1963 Daytona 500 champion and won $25,000. And after all the triumph for the past 10 days, one of the biggest underdog moments in history has happened on February 24th, 1963. You couldn't have scripted this better. And after winning and celebrating the 500, here's what he had to say on what he's going to do with his earnings.
Tiny, it couldn't happen to a nicer guy. Congratulations. Here's your wife over here, looks so elated. Tiny, you've just won $25,000. What will you folks do with it?
Pay our bills.
Pay our bills and add to our fishing camp.
I know you have a fishing camp in Cross, South Carolina. Tiny, you've been racing more than half your life. You got married at a racetrack, didn't you?
Yes, sir. 18 years I've been racing.
And this is probably your biggest day.
Biggest, very biggest.
Well, congratulations to a wonderful couple, Mr. and Mrs. Tiny Lund, formerly of Harlan, Iowa, now living in Cross, South Carolina, and the turbulence in victory lane for two great people. Relax.
I say I was out of gas for the last 4 laps.
You were out of gas when you took the checkered flag?
Yes, sir.
Out of gas, taking the checkered flag. Words from a winner, Tiny Lund.
Tiny and the 4 other men who saved Marvin Panch's life were awarded the Carnegie Medal for the acts of outstanding civilian heroism. At the time, it was the highest civilian medal given in the United States.
After he and 4 other guys were awarded a medal for saving Marvin Panch's life, Tiny Lund managed to run a few more races with Wood Brothers Racing until Marvin Panch came back to the 21 that year. Returning as a journeyman, Tiny Lund manages to win 4 more races in the Grand National Series and drove for more various teams. Unfortunately, on August 17, 1975, at Talladega Superspeedway, tragedy struck. Tiny Lund started 31st in the Talladega 500. He was driving for King Enterprises in the 26 car in that race. On lap number 17, Tiny Lund and J.D. McDuffie collided on a backstretch. Tiny Lund and J.D. McDuffie spun down the track as other cars started crashing behind them. Rookie Terry Link was spun hard into the driver's door of Tiny Lund's Dodge. Terry Link's Pontiac subsequently exploded in flames. 2 spectators in the infield climbed over the catch vents and, with help from driver Walter Ballard, pulled an unconscious Link from his car and managed to revive him. As this was happening, Tiny Lund was extricated from his own car by track rescue teams. He was alive when he reached the track infield hospital, but died less than 10 minutes later of massive chest and internal crush injuries. Drivers were not informed of Tiny Lund's death until the race was over. Although Tiny Lund's career was cut short due to tragedy, he was beloved by fans, by his competitors. On his personal life, he's always enjoyed fishing. He's always known as a prankster, very awesome guy to hang out with, always a funny guy. He even has his own fishing camp. Tiny Lund stood 6 feet, 5 inches tall and weighed about 270 pounds. He was a big guy, and that's how he earned the ironic nickname, Tiny. His achievements, he earned a medal for saving Marvin Panch, same with the 4 other men that were trying to save him. In his racing achievements, he earned a 1973 NASCAR Grand National East Series champion. He was the 1968, 1970, and a 1971 Grand American champion. He was the 1963 Daytona 500 winner, the 1970 Daytona Permatex 300 winner. He was awarded into the International Motorsports Hall of Fame in 1994. He was named one of NASCAR's 50 greatest drivers back in 1998, and he was in the National Dirt Late Model Hall of Fame back in 2016. For nearly 30 years, the Tiny Lund Memorial Race for the IMCA Series has always took place at Harlan, Iowa, at Shelby County Speedway to honor the late great Tiny Lund, who was born and raised at Harlan, Iowa, and grew up at Harlan, Iowa, and pretty much raced at this track as well. 50 years after winning the 1963 Daytona 500 for Wood Brothers Racing, During 2013 Speed Weeks, Wood Brothers Racing revealed a Tiny Lund throwback as the driver Trevor Bayne drove the throwback scheme for the Daytona 500. Unfortunately for the kid from Knoxville, Tennessee, he was involved in crashes such as the first dual race at Daytona with Carl Edwards, Denny Hamlin, and others. And then he was involved in the second big one at the 2013 Daytona 500, collecting Carl Edwards, Brad Keselowski, David Gilliland, Terry Labonte, Ricky Stenhouse Jr., Austin Dillon, and many more. Unfortunately, Trevor Bayne finished 27th in the 2013 Daytona 500. Even though he was in the wrecks throughout Speed Weeks, he still managed to honor Tiny Lund in a kick-ass way after winning the Daytona 500 50 years ago that year. Tiny Lund was a husband, a father, a friend, a true competitor, a winner, a funny guy, a prankster, a fisherman. He was loved by many people. He was 45 years old.